Hello, I am creating this video to explain a few key details about three kinds of organisms we commonly describe as what referred to as algae. So one is what we call the brown algae, then we also have the green algae and the red algae. Let's begin with the brown algae and the anatomy that some of these types of protists can show. When you look at a typical kelp organism, this is going to be absolutely a multicellular organism, and a close inspection of it may reveal structures that may resemble those you see in a plant. So, for example, attached to rocks near the shore of the ocean, of course, underwater, there's going to be like masses of groups of cells that resemble something that looks like a root. So this is indeed called the holdfast, and like a root of a plant anchors it to the soil, this holdfast is going to be anchoring this type of brown algae, the kelp, to the rocks or the substrate underneath the ocean waves. One thing that the holdfast does not do, but the roots of plants actually can do, is going to be absorbing nutrients from the soil. This holdfast is not for the purpose of absorbing nutrients. Nutrients will most likely be absorbed directly by the surfaces of this kelp itself. There's also going to be something that resembles like a stem. This is going to be helping hold certain structures of the kelp upright, and so this is known as a stipe. In a plant, we will call this a stem, or if it was a tree, this would be like the trunk. Then away from the substrate where the kelp is anchored, you're going to see structures that look like leaves. And so those are going to be called blades. Like leaves, blades are going to hold the photosynthetic cells that are going to be capable of capturing sunlight and make sugar by the familiar process we call photosynthesis. In addition to these structures, you may also find sometimes what look like bladders, what looks like little tiny balloons attached to the kelp itself, and those are going to be for the purpose of making kelp float upright, growing in the direction closest to the surface of the water where they can get more light. There are other types of brown algae like sargasso, and you might have heard about the sargasso sea, where you have a lot of kelp-like brown algae organisms just floating on the surface of the ocean, and that floating, again, will be something that the bladders, air bladders, are going to be doing. One interesting detail that brown algae will show, this type of a multicellular protist, is called an alternation of generations. The life cycle of kelps is completed when two generations have passed. One generation of organisms is diploid, meaning its cells are made up of, the cells are going to consist of a nucleus with two sets of chromosomes. And then that generation of diploid organisms will be responsible for producing the next generation, but the next generation is going to be haploid organisms. I invite you right now to really pay close attention to the illustration I have here showing, featuring the life cycle of brown algae, in this case, a type of kelp. So let's begin from the moment of fertilization. Sexual reproduction will be taking place and allowing for an egg produced by a previously existing kelp and to be fertilized by the sperm produced by another one of these progenitor types of kelp. So following fertilization, we know really well that the next stage in development is going to be a zygote. This is a one-cell type of a structure now containing two nuclei, the nucleus from the egg plus the nucleus from the sperm. When the diploid number of chromosomes is restored, now this organism can proceed through the process of mitosis. Mitosis makes cells that are identical to each other, and they're going to be diploid as well. So now development continues, and notice that this generation that we're beginning to see developing is called a sporophyte. Sporophyte is a word that has two roots making it up. One sporo, as you may guess, makes reference to spores, which are going to be reproductive structures used by organisms to make a next generation. So spores, and then the next part, phyte, P-H-Y-T-E, means plant-like. And so this is going to be like a plant that is capable of producing spores. As this kelp continues to develop, it's going to grow in a way that it allows it to fulfill that mission. Now you can see what we call the adult sporophyte, and this is the typical kelp. Sometimes the holdfast gets eaten by sea urchins in the bottom of the ocean, and then these kelp fronds, which we can call the whole organism, the fronds will be washing up on the shore, and then they will break down, they will decompose because they are no longer attached to a substrate, so they can continue with the life cycle. But if we were looking at one of these fronds, the blades, the stipe, the holdfast, the air bladders, this will have, in a specific location along the blades, little sacs containing spores. These sacs containing spores are known as sporangia. Again, spora meaning spores, and angia actually comes from a Greek root that means vessel, like a bottle that is used for containing, for storing a liquid. Or imagine something like a jar where you have preserved things like cucumbers, making pickles, or maybe a preserve like jam. So that's a vessel that stores something of importance. In this case, the thing that this vessel, angia, is storing is going to be spores. Now, these spores are going to develop into two different types of brown algae. One is going to be a female individual, and the other one's going to be a male individual. Now, here's what's really interesting about this alternation of generations. Remember that the sporophyte we were talking about, the typical kelp you are familiar with, and you can see a photo of it here also. This kelp is made up of diploid cells. But these cells that are participating in the process of reproduction, making spores, go through meiosis. So the spores are haploid, meaning they only contain half the number of chromosomes. So these haploid spores develop into a haploid new generation. This female gametophyte is going to have only cells with only one set of chromosomes. This male gametophyte is going to be made up of cells which also contain only one set of chromosomes. So, as we can see now, a diploid generation of kelp, like the ones we typically see, is responsible for making a next generation of haploid individuals. These haploid individuals are called gametophytes. And so while the word sounds new, keep in mind the meaning of roots. Gameto, well, that is making reference to gametes, which are sex cells, specifically eggs and sperm. And phyte, I told you just a moment ago, P-H-Y-T-E means plant-like. So these are going to be plants that are going to be, or plant-like organisms, responsible for producing gametes, which will be eggs and sperm. So the female gametophyte will be responsible for making eggs, and the male gametophyte is going to be responsible for making sperm. Notice a characteristic of this type of brown algae. It belongs to the subgroup Stramenopyle, and the Stramenopyles have two flagella, and they have one hairy flagellum and one smooth flagellum. And you can see that detail with the sperm. These sperm cells have two flagella, one smooth, one hairy, and then when fertilization happens, they are going to be producing a next generation of diploid sporophytes. That's why we call this type of life cycle an alternation of generations. The sporophytes, like kelp we see in this picture, never make more sporophytes. They never make more kelp. Instead, when they reproduce, Asexually, by the process of just making spores, they are producing a new generation of gametophytes. These gametophyte generation individuals are usually so tiny and microscopic we typically don't see them with the naked eye. However, these gametophytes are going to be only haploid. Their cells contain only one set of chromosomes, but they can do still the mission they have in life, which is going to be producing gametes. When gametes are made and sperm fertilize the egg, these gametophytes are then responsible for making the next generation of sporophytes. Gametophytes never reproduce to make more gametophytes. Each generation exists only to make the alternate generation, hence the name Alternation of Generations. And so that is an interesting detail about kelp, and on this next slide, I have some more of those details I have already explained to you in my description. Let's see, let's go to another group of organisms, and these are going to be, I have rhizarians here on my screen, but I want to talk to you about the brown algae, the red algae, and the green algae. So we talked about the brown algae. Let's go ahead and move over to the red and the green algae. These are now going to be part of another supergroup known as the Archaeplastida. And archae, like archaic, means that these types of protists have been around for a long time. And plastida simply means that they contain plastids, like chloroplast, for the sake of performing photosynthesis. Beginning with Rhodophyta, the red algae, they are going to have this type of color because in the plastids they produce are going to, there's going to be an abundance of an accessory pigment which is called phycoerythrin. So erythrin means red. You may remember erythrocytes is the technical name for red blood cells. And so phycoerythrin is going to be a pigment that it reflects red light. And because of the abundance of it, the green pigment we're familiar with, which is chlorophyll, is not going to be as evident. So the color of red algae actually can vary. And sometimes red algae can look red, sometimes it can look bluish or purple, and sometimes it can almost just look green. And so just the color of algae is really not the best way of deciding if it's a rhodophyte, red algae, or a green algae, chlorophyte, or brown algae, which also have their own name. I'm not using that in class, but it's called phaeophyte. But let's continue talking about the red algae. So now you know that those that look red is because they have an abundance of this phycoerythrin pigment. Some of the varieties of red algae that grow in the ocean can actually be edible. And so you might enjoy sushi rolls. And here you see some in the picture. The type of seaweed that is used for the making of sushi is a type of red algae. In Japanese, this is called nori. And it's something delicious, as you may know. And I like to talk about food. That's the red algae. And the green algae, these are going to be, the majority of them are going to be multicellular. There are a couple of exceptions of green algae that may be single cell, but the majority of them are going to be multicellular organisms. Also, the majority of green algae lives in fresh water in the form of filamentous algae. And so in lab, you'll have the opportunity to see something like Spirogyra. And Spirogyra is a type of a filamentous green algae or chlorophyte. Another type of green algae typically studied in labs, and biology labs, is going to be Volvox. And so in Volvox, you can see the biflagellated nature of the cells, and each sphere of cells constitutes a multicellular organism as well. Here's one of the exceptions of this illustration. You can see a type of green algae that lives in the ocean. This is called sea lettuce from the genus Ulva. And if you take a stride along the shore during a low tide here in the Puget Sound, you will find this type of algae is everywhere, and it's typically identified by the flat and broad and smooth appearance of the blades for this type of algae. Here you see another type of green algae found in the oceans. This is Caulerpa, and I haven't seen these here in the Puget Sound, but Ulva, the sea lettuce, for sure has been found there. Another type of green algae that is studied in biology is going to be the Charophytes. But the Charophytes will be a group of algae I will be making more reference to later when we begin to talk about plant diversity and the evolutionary hypotheses for plants. Something that I wanted to mention about this green algae is that they are going to be important contributors to the food chain of aquatic organisms like brown algae and red algae. These are going to be the producers that many organisms like fish and snails and sea urchins will be depending on to obtain their energy to be able to also carry their own life cycles. Well, I hope you've learned something from this exploration of, like I said, a few key details about algae, and I will be making one more video on the Uniconta supergroup. I will see you soon. Goodbye.